Hi everyone. So today we are going to be talking about simplifying sentences. So first of all, why do we want simple sentences in legal writing? We want to explain complex and difficult topics as effectively as we can. We want our reader to understand the first time they read it. And ultimately, good legal writing is concise and to the point. So our goals for legal writing are to answer the reader's questions before they even have to ask them, to explain the law clearly and quickly, highlight the most important things about the law, and convince the reader of your conclusions. And that's true whether it's persuasive or predictive writing, whether it's a memo or a brief. So the first tip to simplifying your sentences is to use concrete language. So concrete language, we want the reader to know exactly what we mean just from our writing. So we want to be specific. Also, we want to avoid unnecessary legal jargon and Latin phrases, which can be difficult to understand, and we want to make it easier for your reader. Also, you want to say what you mean. So a lot of times when I'm tutoring students in the Writing Center, I will ask them to explain what they mean in one of their sentences, and they will say something out loud which is different from what they wrote on the page. So if you write a sentence and you would explain it differently out loud, then you should probably consider rewriting it. So here's an example of abstract language. To succeed in law school, you should consider working hard on the various assignments. So how could we change this to be more concrete? Because reading this, I don't know how I'm supposed to succeed in law school other than working hard, which seems really obvious, right? So how we can change that to be more concrete is to give your reader specific things they can do, right? You go to every class, you do your reading, and you take notes. Now I know how I'm supposed to succeed in law school, and it sounds super easy and not hard at all. Okay, we're going to skip this because I'm not there with you. So tip number 2 is to avoid long sentences and complex phrases. So first of all, legal writing is formal writing. However, that doesn't mean that our writing has to sound fancy. In fact, we want to avoid sounding pretentious or complex, specifically because it is more difficult to understand. We want to be effective, but that doesn't mean that we have to be creative. There are some times when you have more freedom in your writing, like when you write a note for your journal or a paper for your seminar. But for a majority of the legal writing you will do in school and after, the objective is really simple. It's just to make the reader understand as quickly as possible. Okay, so first, you want to know your reader. Judges, senior attorneys, and law clerks just don't have the time or the patience to read something that is poorly written, that is not concise, that's not effective, okay? Second, you want to aim for shorter sentences that each make a distinct point. So if you're making multiple points in one sentence, you should probably consider breaking that up, okay? Another thing that you can do, a lot of people think from their English classes that this is not allowed, but it actually is allowed in legal writing, as you can start a sentence with a conjunction, okay? So here is an example of that. You can pause this and read it. Okay, so here you can see that I've basically started a second sentence with a conjunction, which just allows it kind of to continue from the flow of that first sentence, but it breaks it up nicely. Okay, the next thing you can do is add punctuation that acts as a visual pause to your reader. So obviously we know that a period tells us to pause and that a new thought is about to start, but colons and dashes within a sentence can do the exact same thing. So I'm going to let you pause and read this, but this is one example of how you can break up some sentences with some punctuation. And I could have made this 4 sentences instead of 2, but if you just don't want to break up a sentence, this is one way to still give your reader kind of a break and a pause. Okay, so here's an example of a sentence that is too long. Think about how you feel when you see a sentence as a reader that is several lines long, okay? You should pause this and consider, how could we break this sentence up? Okay, I'm moving on. All right, so this is definitely a better way to break up that one long sentence, okay? We broke it up into 3 sentences. We used periods. Okay, so here is one thing to note. Sometimes breaking up a sentence can actually add more words to your writing, and you might think that is antithetical to what I'm trying to get you to do, which is simplify your writing. But even though we want to be succinct, better writing that uses slightly more words and is easier to understand is better than writing that uses less words but's not clear, okay? When the writing isn't clear, a reader will often read the sentence 2 to 3 times anyway before moving on, and that takes them more time than it would have taken them had they just understood it the first time through. So we want to prioritize clarity over brevity. And as you can see here on the left side is the original one, and on the right side is the one we fixed, but it is a little bit longer. Okay, we've talked about long sentences. Now let's talk about phrases that make your sentences longer and your writing more complex. So many introductory or transitionary phrases can be simplified by replacing them with one word. So we have on the left side a complex phrase, and on the right side it's concise replacement. Okay, so we have in order to, which can just become to, in the present case, which can just become here. You also have in that case becomes there. These are all concise replacements that are not less formal, they're just more effective. They mean the same thing, but they get the job done faster. Okay, the third tip is to use active voice. Writing an active voice clearly identifies the actor and the action, it uses fewer words, and it keeps sentences simple and easy to understand. How do we spot passive voice instead of active voice? So you're going to look for a form of the to be and a verb. So am, is, are, was, were, etc. And it's often paired with a preposition. Okay? Here's a list of prepositions just in case you've forgotten. I've bolded some of the common ones, okay? And here is that in action. So here is the formula for active voice. You're going to have a subject who does the verb to the object, okay? So Sarah texted Haley, the sheriff arrested the drunk driver, the court will likely find the defendant guilty. Now, passive voice flips the object and the subject order around. So you have the object receiving a verb from the subject, okay? So this is where we often see a prepositional phrase and a form of the to be verb, okay? Haley received a text from Sarah. The drunk driver was arrested by the sheriff. The defendant is likely to be found guilty by the court, okay? So two things. First of all, was arrested. Was is a to be form of the verb. Clearly, the defendant is likely to be found guilty is obviously a to be verb. So that's what I mean when I say a form of the to be verb. And then also keep in mind for this third example on the bottom here that we don't actually have the prepositional phrase I was talking about in the sentence, okay? But it's implied at the end. And this is just a time where it's implied that the court is the one who found the defendant guilty, because we all know that. If the defendant is found guilty, who's finding them guilty? It's always going to be the court. Okay? But there are times in writing where you might want to use passive voice for a stylistic reason, and that can be appropriate. Most of the time you want to use active voice, but there are a few times when it's okay to use passive voice. So, the first time is when you want to avoid appearing confrontational by leaving out a subject. So instead of saying Maxine made a lot of mistakes, I could just say mistakes were made, and that way I'm not calling out Maxine. The second time is when you don't know the subject, and so there's no point in mentioning it. So here's an example. The jewelry was stolen last night. I don't know who stole it, so I'm not going to say by someone. You just say the jewelry was stolen. The third time is when you want to emphasize the object and not the subject, okay? So Parker was indicted for fraud on July 5th, 2021. Here, my goal of this sentence is to just say when he was indicted. I don't really need to know who indicted him, and it's also pretty obvious. Second, the president was sworn in on a cold January morning. This is the same thing. I don't need to know who swore him in. That's really not the point, and it's also obvious. Third, Elvis is rumored to be alive. Who is rumoring him to be alive? The people, like everybody. So I'm not going to say everybody rumors Elvis to be alive, or Elvis is rumored to be alive by the people. I can just say he's rumored to be alive. Okay, tip number 4 is to avoid nominalizations. And you might be thinking, what is a nominalization? So nominalizations convert verbs or adjectives into nouns by relying on a weaker verb. What this does is it confuses the reader by messing with the subject plus verb formula. It often adds prepositions, it adds length to the sentence, and it hides the action and requires the reader to translate. New legal writers often use nominalizations because they sound fancier, right? But they're actually not. They just make your sentence more complicated. Here are some examples, okay? So this is on the right side, we have verbs that we are nominalizing into nouns. So we have intend, intervene, distort, and those become intention, intervention, distortion, okay? So that would be, instead of she intended to eat ice cream, I would say she had an intention to eat ice cream. As you can see, that makes the sentence longer and more complicated. On the right side here, we have adjectives that you are nominalizing into nouns, okay? So you have applicable, applicability, careless, carelessness, difficult, difficulty, etc. And you can pause here if you want to read this list, or on the very far left, the endings that are often on nominalized verbs and adjectives, okay? Here's some examples. So the top one is going to be the nominalization, and the bottom is just the verb. The committee made an agreement to increase research assistants' wages. Really what we should say, the committee agreed, right? Sydney gave a presentation about her idea to the board, should just become Sydney presented. Much shorter, much sharper. The parties entered into a settlement for $6 billion. Can just be the party settled. She exhibited her carelessness when she let the dog out without a leash. She was careless when she let the dog out without a leash. So the first three are nouns, and the last one is an adjective that we're nominalizing. So notice the difference, okay? It's just a little bit different, but it's still the same thing where you're turning something into a noun and using a weaker verb like was, gave, entered, made, okay? All right, so the last tip is going to be to paraphrase. So why should we paraphrase? Relying too heavily on direct quotes in your writing is lazy. It means that someone else is doing all the work for you. It covers your voice as a writer, and it relinquishes control of the writing. Second reason is that court's language is usually really confusing and ineffective. Okay, I know we've all been in a first year class where we read half of a case and realized we have no idea what was just said. I have no idea what's going on. We want to trust ourselves to synthesize that language from the court and explain it to your reader more simply. That is what you're being asked to do by the reader. Your reader could have read the case or the source themselves, but they've asked you to do it for them and to convey the information in the most effective way possible. Lastly, relying on direct quotes doesn't mean that your reader will trust you more. Often it just means that your reader gets the idea that you didn't have time to do the mental work yourself, and you might not even know what you're talking about. Okay, so when should we direct quote instead of paraphrasing? There are a few times when we want to avoid paraphrasing. So the first is when the source's language cannot be rewritten without losing meaning, effect, or strength. So if you don't think that you could explain it another way, maybe the court or whoever it was said it the best way the first time. The next time is when exactly what was said is really important. So this is important for statutory language. We need to know what exactly the statute says so we can interpret it properly. Those are not times where you want to paraphrase what is being said. And then the last time is when the phrase is a term of art. So if the court invented a term or a phrase for that case, it needs to be used. You should not paraphrase it. And keep in mind that even if you do decide to quote, you should only quote the part that you need. You almost never need to quote an entire sentence. All right. You can pause here and read this, but this is an example of complicated court language. And moving on. This is what I think is wrong with it. So first of all, you have a lot of interlaced clauses. All of these highlighted portions are the beginning of another clause, and this is one sentence, okay? So we have about 6 different things going on here. That's very complicated. Next, we have some confusing phrases. I do not know what no consideration additional to the services incident to the employment means. I had to read that 4 times to figure out what that said, okay? It's confusing, it's not intuitive. Third, there are a lot of prepositions in this sentence, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but it can be a good indicator that you're using passive voice or you're writing really confusingly, complexly, and you don't need to. And the last point is that there are 3 or 4 points in a single sentence, and we want to break up 1 point for 1 sentence. So pause this here. Think about how we can make this better. Okay, moving on. This is a way that I paraphrase this rule, okay? So you can pause it and read it, but you're going to notice I used fewer words. There's only 4 lines, not 6. Shorter sentence, fewer prepositions, and it includes the court's phrase instead of the entire sentence the court wrote, okay? All right. Thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions, my email is there on the left, and you should come see us in the Writing Center this semester.